Welcome back to Boston Leaders Unplugged. We are recording this in the middle of Pride Month, and we are incredibly privileged to be sitting down with one of the Boston Jewish community's literally most tenured leaders, Idit Klein, the national CEO of Keshet, who will be stepping back from the leadership of Keshet after 24 years come the middle of the summer. And there's a lot to talk about, and I'm really excited to share to our audience some of the story of Keshet, the work of LGBTQ inclusion within the Boston Jewish community, the story of how a very, very small, when it started, Boston Jewish organization has grown into a national force across the country, creating cultural and political change for the full inclusion of LGBTQ Jews within Jewish space, and to advance the politics and social needs of the LGBTQ community more broadly. And just really excited to talk with one of my favorite leaders about her work, her journey, and her vision for our community. So welcome, Idit.
Thank you so much, and happy to be here talking with one of my favorite leaders.
Why don't we start not from the beginning, but at least start from the beginning of today. Keshet is a national organization, but it didn't start that way. And 24 years ago, if I recall correctly, it literally was something you were doing at your kitchen table. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the early days of Keshet and how that came to be?
Sure. Now it's very exciting to talk about, and it was exciting at the time, but also quite challenging. So it wasn't my kitchen table, but it was a room in my apartment, in my triple-decker in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. And the summer of 2001, I got very clear that Keshet, that I had been a part of as an all-volunteer group of a small number of queer Jews in Boston, that organization was going to continue to ebb and flow in its activity, mostly ebb, unless someone stepped up and tried to really make something happen, because volunteers were tired, volunteers were scattering, and it just wasn't happening. And so I decided to try to be that person. And I made a phone call to this building, to Barry Schraig's office, who was then president of CJP. And I, was a 28-year-old nobody, really. And somehow I got an appointment with him. And I showed up and I made the case for why I thought CJP should invest in Keshet. And he said, well, we've never done anything like this before, but I'll find the money. And he asked what we needed. And I would say my only regret from that time of what was otherwise sort of a gloriously chutzpahdik and successful moment on my part was that I asked for too little. I asked for what at the time felt like a very large sum of money, which was $25,000.
Wow.
But I didn't know better. But that's okay. That, for me, at the time, was enough for me to say, okay, I can start working full time and start raising more money and launch this organization. And so that was really the beginning. Another relevant piece at the time of someone who's also been a through line is I knew Bill Gabovich, who remains a leader in CJP and in JCRC. I knew him through what was then called the Jewish Organizing Initiative, now Join for Justice. And he was then a kind of young member of a CJP committee. And he made it clear to Barry that this was something that he supported and wanted to make happen. And that also made a difference. So I feel very indebted in a lot of ways to kind of the leadership of 126 High Street, both for the financial support, but beyond that, really, I would say for the kind of political support and psychological support of what it meant to me as a young emerging Jewish leader to have people in the Boston Jewish establishment say, we believe in you, we're going to take a chance on you, and we believe in this emerging vision that you are sharing, and we want to be a part of it.
We can probably spend a whole segment talking about Bill Gabovich and the ways in which he would and does continue to identify young emerging leaders. You were a JOI fellow, I think.
I was in JOI's first year.
I had a similar experience with him 10 years later, obviously, when he was the chair of our board and was the person who was leading the board when I was hired. And like people across this community will say, Bill's the kind of guy who identifies young people and sees their potential to be far more than they are, what they're currently doing, and then to make the connections for them here in this building or elsewhere in the community. And it's nice to think about that part that he played in connecting you and Barry and CJP and Keshet. But before we go forward, can you say a little more about like what Keshet's vision was at that time and what this then very nascent local organization for whom a $25,000 grant was a big deal? What was it doing? What was it trying to achieve?
So I would say that as the first staff member, and then gradually as more people got engaged, vision, big picture, is not very different from today. It was of a Jewish world where LGBTQ Jews can feel a full sense of belonging and feel at home, and a Jewish community that stands up and fights for LGBTQ rights. Now, granted, in our early days, that vision was within the boundaries of Boston as a local Jewish organization. But our first big project was producing a documentary film chronicling the campaign to create what was then called a Gay Straight Alliance at what was then called the New Jewish High School of Greater Boston, today Gann Academy.
Back when it was in the bank.
Right. And back when it was in the bank. And we embarked upon that project as a local organization, but very much seeing the potential for national impact of chronicling and amplifying that story. And sure enough, the film premiered. We were bombarded with requests for film screenings and speaking engagements and trainings and consultations. And, we were catapulted into the national arena and soon after made a decision to become a national organization.
Well, before we get to the national organization, part of that story, because
Yes.
this is how I first met you, was through the film project. And you were working with students, faculty, others at New Jew to build this Gay Straight Alliance. And then you started, or to support their efforts to build a Gay Straight Alliance, and then decided to start filming it. Like, when did that decision happen?
Yeah. So I was really working with one student, because initially there was one person whose name is Shulamit Eisen who was out, and there were no teachers who were really fully out. There were a couple who were kind of out, but none who were really fully out, and there were no kids who were out. So it was really Shulamit Eisen who started this. And then over the course of the year-long campaign, which started with her going right to the head of school and trying to convince him, and which initially failed colossally and devastatingly, over the course of her campaign, other students came out, and then 4 faculty out of a faculty of 24 came out, including the head of the Bible department. And it was really a kind of transformative moment for the whole community. Susie Tanchel. But in terms of your other question around filming, this is a film. This is a documentary that was created after the events that were in it. The way the film came about is towards the end of the campaign, when it was starting to become clear that the administration was going to approve the student's request, I invited Shulamit Eisen, the main student, to speak at a Keshet house party. It was actually our first ever house party. And there was a man there named Marty Spagat, Zichrono Livracha, who was really moved and kind of blown away by her. And he went up to me and he said, I want to give you $5,000 to record a short video telling her story. And he was not out at the time, out to his family, but not out kind of in the broader world, had come out to the degree that he was out later in life. And he said, I will never be able to be a public figure like her, but I can help you amplify her story. Wow. And so I called up my friend Irina Feingold, who's a filmmaker, and I said, I have $5,000, gonna make this 5-minute video profile. It's probably a couple-month project. And she said, great. So we started interviewing Shulamit. It became really clear, well, we needed to interview the other students. Well, we needed to interview the teachers. Well, we needed to interview the head of school. So it became clear that, yes, this was her story, but it was really a much larger story and the story of a whole community. And so then we said, okay, it'll be a half-hour film, and then eventually it became a full-length documentary film. But all of it was filmed kind of after the events that are depicted in it.
God, I appreciate you sharing a little more of that story. It feels very close to my heart to know more about the story of that, because the film was how I came to actually first meet you.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember correctly, it was probably around 2004, 2005. You were raising money
To finish it. Yes.
And you had a house meeting in New York. I think it was at Sally Goslin's.
It was, yes.
That's how we first met.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that transition into the national space. Now you're in this national space. You're raising money around the country to finish this film. You are developing tools for schools and others to watch and discuss the film. Take us to the journey to being a national organization.
It was exciting. It was dizzying. We literally finished the film. We walked out of the sound studio, or I don't know, some whatever was the final juncture in finishing the film at 5 a.m. on a Wednesday, and the film premiered on Sunday afternoon at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So it was really down to the wire, and we were kind of fueled through some very challenging moments during the 3.5 years that it took us to complete the film by this sense that this was a story that needed to be told nationally. But we did not have the resources or the time to come up with a plan for what to do. So the film premieres to a sold-out audience. I forget if you were there.
I was not.
You were not there. And then there were more sold-out audiences. And then, as I said before, we were immediately bombarded with requests for film screenings from all around the country, and actually eventually all around the world. And so that led us pretty quickly to ask the question, okay, do we want this to be a national product that will eventually run its course? Or is this going to be the moment where we develop a different kind of theory of change and a different kind of set of programs that should work nationally? And we actually, back to CJP, got a limited grant on top of our regular allocation to do strategic planning specifically to answer that question.
Uh-huh.
It was a very truncated, maybe a 2-3 month process. And we emerged from that process where I think we knew we would emerge from the outset, but it was good to go through a thoughtful process of deciding, yes, we are going to work nationally. And initially, at that point, what we imagined our national work being was going to be an outgrowth of the film, of doing education and training, providing resources, that being our principal resource, but eventually providing other resources. And then as we established offices in other parts of the country, and as other needs emerged, most dramatically in terms of working with queer Jewish youth, we expanded our programs from there.
Mm-hmm. I want to explore what it's meant to deal with issues of avoidance, silence in the Jewish community. From where I sit, Keshet, so much of Keshet's work has been about expanding space in the Jewish community, and looking back 24 years, and certainly talking to emerging queer leaders in the Jewish community today, the world was different then. And I would love to talk about what was different about the world that you were starting this work in, and maybe some of the challenges that there were around silence, avoidance, unwilling to grapple with these issues. Even in the story you were telling about Hineni, as you mentioned, she went straight to the head of school, or direct to the head of school, maybe that's the wrong choice of word, and had resistance. And yet a couple of years later, he sat down on camera and was participated in the documentary. So things were changing in real time as you were rolling out your work. Can you talk about some of that?
Sure. It's very dramatic when I think about the arc of change during this time. And it's one of the things I feel most grateful for, because, when you think of an historical timeline, 24 years, 25 years, 30 years, that doesn't even appear. It's not even a blip on a timeline. And yet, I can point to kind of concrete dynamics or concrete laws or absence of laws that existed 20 plus years ago, and are completely different today. I mean, so much so that people entirely take them for granted. Like, an example, one of my early challenges, I mean, maybe you could call it avoidance or silence. I experienced it as just people not having LGBTQ Jews on their mental radar screens in any way as relevant to Jewish life. Because the most common response that I would get from straight Jewish community leaders when I started building this organization and would explain what I was doing was first sort of a puzzled expression, and then questions like, so you're saying that's a Jewish organization? So wait, Keshet works in the Jewish community? So gay and lesbian Jews, are there many of you? There was, it became apparent to me early on the extent to which that we were not a part of most cisgender straight Jews' consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
There was not an understanding that our lives were present and mattered, which feels somehow like a stage before silence and avoidance, because it's a complete absence. Certainly there was silence and avoidance and opposition and hostility later on in different quarters. Then there was also tolerance and sort of a people being glad and wanting us to be glad that they were tolerant of LGBTQ people and needing to understand that, of course, no one wants to be just tolerated in their community. And today, I would say a lot of our work now takes place in that gap. The change gap is between communities that tolerate and communities that fully embrace. But back to the questions I used to get when I started building this organization, I don't remember the last time I got one of those questions, because the consciousness has just shifted so dramatically.
100%. I mean, I remember in the early days talking about sort of like some of those reactions of like, well, we don't have any gay and lesbian Jewish
we'll do a program
in our synagogue.
We'll do a program when we have some.
Right. And it's like, that you know of.
Right.
Can you, because you raised it, can you just touch a little bit on the distinction between tolerate and embrace? Or like, what is that sort of spectrum or progression that when you're doing a change in institutions that you're looking at?
Sure. So, I often, in talking about this, think about this quote from Stuart Milk, who is the nephew of Harvey Milk, Zichrono Livracha. And Stuart Milk somewhat famously said, do you know the quote I'm about to say?
Please.
He said,
to be fair, I think I've heard many of your stories once or twice over the years.
Yes, this is very boring for you.
This is great for me.
Okay. So Stuart,
are you kidding? I love having you have it in our studio.
Thank you. So Stuart Milk likes to say, I go outside in the summer, even though I absolutely hate mosquitoes, but I tolerate them because I like to be outside. Gay people are not mosquitoes. We are the butterflies of the world. So I think it's the difference between being related to as a mosquito. So it's the difference between a community relating to you as a mosquito or some other kind of inconvenience or mild discomfort, and a community relating to you like a beautiful butterfly that you kind of exclaim with wonder when you see it. And of course, you want its presence. So when you think about queer people, it's the difference between saying you can be in our synagogue, your kid can be in our day school, but we're not going to really talk about your life. We're not going to talk about hardships that you might be experiencing in the broader world. We're not going to do anything to make you visible or to recognize your experience. That's a tolerant community. Mm-hmm. It's the community that proudly says, well, we don't kick gay people out.
Right.
And then, an embracing community is a community where when kids come out, their rabbis and Hebrew school teachers and day school teachers and youth group advisors say Mazal Tov. And those kids remember that for the rest of their lives. It's a community where the social justice committee incorporates attention to LGBTQ rights into its work. It's a community that recognizes Pride Month and Trans Day of Visibility, among the many other days of significance to its community. So it's a community that sees the queer people in the fullness of their experience and identities, as opposed to letting them exist quietly and somewhat invisibly.
Another of what I know were highly informative experiences for you and for Keshet, which was the marriage equality campaign in Massachusetts, which was still in Keshet's early years. And if I'm correct, probably the place that brought you into more direct relationship with JCRC as JCRC and not just as an organization who had some wonderfully supportive board members like Bill Gabovich.
Well, actually, it's funny if you don't know this history, Jeremy. In 2002, we needed a new fiscal sponsor, and we actually were struggling to find one, and JCRC came through and became our fiscal sponsor.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I'm glad that you can hear something new during this conversation.
This is awesome.
Yes. So I was really grateful to JCRC then, and they were
Nancy Kaufman's
under
leadership.
Nancy Kaufman's leadership. And then a couple years later, when marriage equality came to Massachusetts, or became legal in the spring of 2004, and then immediately there was an attempt to rescind that right by passing a one-man, one-woman constitutional marriage amendment. The JCRC was our most key partner in the mobilization work that we were doing, which was very much an uphill battle at that point to get the Jews of Massachusetts to show up and to fight to preserve marriage equality. To be clear, in 2004 and 2005, and the fight went from 2004 to 2007. Those first couple of years, it was an uphill battle everywhere in Massachusetts, not just in the Jewish community. But people today are often very surprised and almost skeptical when I tell them how hard it was to find support in those early days, and how in those early days, every time we were able to identify a rabbi who was willing to publicly stand with us, it was cause for a happy dance in my office and for a public celebration. Because initially what most rabbis said was either I'm not ready or my congregation isn't ready. And when the JCRC early on in 2004, it might have even been in late 2003, I forget, when the JCRC put out a statement in support of the Goodrich decision, the Supreme Judicial Court decision in Massachusetts, which legalized same-sex marriage, that was the first in the country, the first time that such an establishment Jewish organization had proclaimed its support for marriage equality. And that was kind of a revolutionary moment in a way that now is hard to remember or hard to really conceive of, because we live in such a different reality with different assumptions of what community norms are. But back then in the early to mid 2000s, it was not the norm in Jewish life to support marriage equality.
Right. You've become a prominent national leader, both within the Jewish community and in the LGBTQ community, as two separate and obviously overlapping communities. And you hold the space in which these communities overlap, sometimes are in tension, sometimes you're showing up in one or the other speaking on behalf of.
When there have been tensions and challenges, they have been very painful. I actually can't think of a tension or challenge that we've experienced that hasn't been about Israel, honestly. I think they've all been about Israel and Palestine.
Sure.
More recently, Israel and Gaza and the war. So, so those have been, very fraught, very painful moments for us as an organization, for me personally as an Israeli American. And I am very proud of a lot of the work that we have done in those settings, the way that we have chosen to kind of fight to be in relationship and push ourselves to have hard conversations that in almost every case, have yielded understanding and change and have enabled the kind of movement that we were looking for.
Can you share a little more, maybe tell one or two of those stories?
I'd be happy to tell the story. Sure. So I'll tell you two stories.
Okay.
So in November 2023, a major national LGBTQ rights organization that we had worked with in the past put out a statement about Israel and Gaza that many of us at Keshet found problematic and painful. And it was being condemned publicly by some of our colleague Jewish organizations. Mm-hmm. But we knew them.
Right.
And so I took a deep breath and I called their CEO and I asked to meet for lunch. And we set up a time to meet for an hour and 15 minutes. Began the conversation. 3.5 hours pass. She asked a lot of questions about Jewish history, about anti-Semitism, about Israel. At one point, some question that she asked me led me to say, okay, if I'm going to answer that, then I actually need to start in 586 BCE and then take you through Jewish history. And that's what I did. I mean, I'm not an historian, but, I did my best. And at the end of the conversation, she talked about how much she had learned and how much she appreciated the time that I had spent and how much she appreciated that we didn't just call them out for what they said, but that I took a chance on talking and engaging and seeing perhaps that will make a difference and perhaps that will lead us to, at the end of the conversation, to feel differently about the relationship. And it did, because at the end of the conversation, she said, I can promise you we will not use that language again. Mm. And they have kept to that. So that is one. Another story, a more local story, happened in Florida last Pride season. Last Pride season, as I'm sure you recall, was the first Pride season of my queer life, in which I heard lots of LGBTQ Jews speak about being afraid. Mm-hmm. Being afraid not of homophobes or transphobes, but of their own LGBTQ community. Mm-hmm. And that was devastating. And we had some really hard conversations amongst our senior staff at Keshet around whether we should just cancel we had plans to be in 17 different prides around the country, mm-hmm. and whether we should just cancel those plans because, of course, what was most important was to keep our people safe.
Right.
But in the end, we decided we were going to honor Pride and we were not going to hide. And mm-hmm. so we were going to show up and we were going to put different kinds of security measures in place. And I worked closely with the then CEO of A Wider Bridge, a colleague organization, to develop a series of recommendations that they publicized a lot, and we took directly to Pride organizers in each of the cities and towns where we were marching. And to our relief and with gratitude, the experience that we had was, to a person, every single Pride organizer responded with some relief of their own, that we were coming to them to say, we're just going to share what everybody's thinking, which is the Jews are scared. And they were grateful for our recommendations, and they promised to implement them, and they did. And one sort of ripple effect of that whole experience was the story I'm going to share that happened at Miami Pride, which is when our people showed up to march in the parade and saw that right in front of them was the contingent from Equality Florida, the mm-hmm. statewide LGBTQ rights organization, which is our key partner in Florida. And before the parade started, one of their senior people came up to our lead Florida staff person, John Cohen, and said, John, I know that things feel really hard right now for a lot of you in the Jewish community and that people may be feeling vulnerable. So I want you to know, if things heat up at any point, you can just merge into our contingent and we will surround you.
Mm-hmm. Powerful.
Yes. Now, Baruch Hashem, they didn't need to do that because things were fine, but just knowing that, they initiated that offer and offered that reassurance of, we're going to protect you from every angle and make sure you stay safe. For better or for worse, I would say it's LGBTQ organizations that we don't work with, where we see some language that feels hard or painful. And it has not been our role to kind of go out there proactively and initiate conversations with everyone. We focus on those with whom we have relationships and where we feel like we can make a difference.
There's so much discourse in the Jewish community post October 7th about where are our allies, where are these particularly capital P progressive organizations that we've quote unquote stood by. There's a discourse around this. And I will freely admit for myself, I don't think I've always felt that question as deeply as some of the people who ask it of me, because the organizations we were in relationship with on October 6th, we did see that outreach. We did see that empathy after October 7th. And you touched on this about like the relationships you hold and that you were in conversation with, and then you see other things on Instagram from groups that you're not in a relationship with. And I'm sort of like wondering if we could unpack just a little bit sort of like that dynamic of the Jewish community's expectations and how we, as Jewish leaders who are sitting in lots of different communities on behalf of and as Jews, can help the Jewish community think about this and help the Jewish community sort of reflect on its own disappointment.
Something that's been helpful to me when I have had moments of feeling disappointed, even by a non-Jewish friend not showing up, is reflecting on the degree to which I and almost all Jews I know in this country, I think, spent most of our lives relating to anti-Semitism as a terrible phenomenon of the past. And so if that's how we related to it, then it helps me understand the degree to which non-Jews for whom this is not their lived experience don't relate to it, don't see it, don't think about it. And then I also think about just how, anti-Semitism is a very complicated type of bigotry and hate. And, all of the dynamics in this country around, the presumption of whiteness, in our generation and beyond among the majority of Jews in this country. And, whiteness, being part of what it means to be, the most powerful class. And so I think there are a lot of reasons, there are a lot of dynamics at play for why it wasn't obvious to a lot of non-Jews to reach out to their Jewish friends and colleagues on October 8th and beyond. And I say that not saying that we shouldn't share with them. We actually need you, and we expect you to do differently next time. So it's not about sort of excusing it, but for me, it's helpful for me, it's helpful, and I would say for the Jewish community, it would be helpful as a way to, understand that dynamic. So, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors on both sides, and somehow I never thought about the fact that being born in 1972, I was born less than 30 years after my grandparents crawled out of concentration camps. I thought about that post-October 7th. And it was a really kind of both profound and horrifying moment. And I was just trying to understand, like, how is it that I related to as at once this very present, very alive force in my life, because it was always been a very animating force in terms of why I want to do justice work. But it also felt distant and past, even though it was alive in the lives of my grandparents and other people in my family who, thank God I was able to grow up with. But I related to it as past, distant history. And then somehow naming and seeing I was born less than 30 years later. It was a shock. And to me, that's kind of emblematic of the way in which, not everyone, obviously, but I think many of us in broader American society, as well as in the American Jewish community, have related to anti-Semitism as an acute threat as something that is very remote.
Mm-hmm. Another part of Keshet's work, which is near and dear, I know, to both of our hearts, supporting queer youth and particularly trans youth. Can you talk about how that emerged, how it has become such a central part of Keshet's work, and what it's been like for you?
One of my most favorite things to talk about. So for years, when people would ask me, how do you work with youth? How do you work with youth? I would say the way we work with youth is we offer training and resources to adults who work with youth so that they can create communities that are supportive of youth. And then in February or March of 2012, I received 2 emails in the same week from 2 kids who did not know each other. One was a gay boy who was active in NIFTY, the Reform Jewish Youth Movement, and the other from a identified girl who was active in BBYO. And both of them had youth group advisors who had just been at a multi-movement training seminar that we had offered. And their advisors had both mentioned to them in this kind of offhand way that they had just been trained by Keshet. And so they wrote to me that they were furious with their youth group advisors and their youth movements, that the fact that their youth movements had decided to invest in becoming more competent around LGBTQ matters, it wasn't shared as a formal announcement. It was just like, oh, by the way, you might be interested in this, and was shared privately with them, not with all of the kids. So they were mad at their youth movements and wanted me to know that. And then they also wanted me to know that they recognized that the work that Keshet was doing with their youth movements, they said, and probably other Jewish institutions, that's going to create a better world for kids like me a few years from now. But what about me today?
Mm-hmm.
And it was it feels almost like a miraculous moment that these 2 teens who did not know each other wrote me almost the exact same letter in the same week in winter of 2012. And then I happened, my day school Orthodox rabbi would say, there's no such thing as a coincidence. There's only Hashem. So whatever it was, I was at a retreat at the Isabella Friedman Jewish Retreat Center and was talking with the then retreat director, David Weisberg, and was sharing some of this with him. And we just, over the course of a breakfast on a Sunday, hatched the idea to get funds for a pilot Shabbaton to bring together LGBTQ Jewish teens that summer. And we did in August of 2012. And I went into the weekend relating to it as probably a one-time thing.
Mm-hmm.
And after the, 4th or 5th teen stopped in their tracks and said with a tone of wonderment, "Oh my God, I can't believe how amazing it feels to be somewhere where I can be queer and Jewish." I just heard kids say some variation of that sentence over and over that weekend. And that made me feel like this is going to be a new program at Keshet. And so that year we just had a small group of kids. The next year we had 2 Shabbatonim. The following year we had 3. At our most, we've had 6 a year. In the last year, we had 3 or 4. I forget exactly how many. But these are weekends that are consistently I'm not someone who uses the word transformative to describe our work unless I think it really is merited. And I think it really is in this case from the way kids talk about the impact on their lives. I mean, we have a kid, she has shared this story publicly. We have a board member now, Alex Bernstein, who came to her first Shabbaton really because her parents kind of convinced / voluntold her, "You are going." And she was not going to shul. She was so angry with the Jewish community. Had an extraordinary weekend. Next Shabbaton, she's leading services. P.S. She's starting at Hebrew College Rabbinical School in the fall.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I feel like we are returning to our running theme from about 12 years ago, which is weird. I can remember like the first time you were telling a story of that early Shabbaton at one of the Keshet National Board meetings. And obviously I was on the board at that time when you first created the national board. And I don't know, you made me cry. And it's been a running joke about certain board members who cry every time you tell these stories coming out of these first Shabbatons, and now you got me all teary-eyed again thinking about some of those people that Keshet was reaching 12, 13 years ago are now rabbinical students and taking on really profound
I think we have at least one rabbi.
That's amazing.
Since then.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we joke that the Columbia JTS joint program should pay us commission because there are so many kids who've come from Keshet to that program.
That's awesome.
So, and there are kids who have also the Shabbaton for them and their connection with the mentors they have found through Keshet staff, through college students who return as staff. That has been what has enabled them to kind of stay grounded in their strength and return and lobby at the Texas state legislature. So very different kind of expression of strength, but obviously one that is also essential.
I'm mindful of time, and I have a couple of things I want to spend a little time with you on, but I want to talk specifically about the more recent work around trans youth, which I know emerges out of all that engagement with youth in the Shabbatons and other spaces. And it was a space where, I was very proud to come here in 2011 to an organization that already had a track record, which you sort of described, taking on marriage equality.
And then JCRC was our partner in fighting for trans rights in Massachusetts.
And that's the place where I think we got to work together organizationally, or one of the many places.
Yes.
But the work for trans youth is definitely not over. So, can you say a little bit about where that work is today?
Sure. So, it's in two dimensions. So one, within the sphere of Shabbatonim, there, certainly, are cisgender queer youth as well, but there are many, many trans and non-binary youth, and for them particularly now, Shabbatonim and the relationships that they are able to establish and maintain through them are such lifelines. We saw this actually during COVID. We were an organization that had never had, like many, had never had online programs in it with any kind of seriousness. And our youth programs were only in person. But then, of course, that changed overnight. And what we discovered was that there were a lot of kids zooming into our online youth programs who said things like, "Thank God you are finally doing a program online, because I've been asking my parents to let me go to a Shabbaton for the last 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and I may be sitting on the floor of my closet in my bedroom with my earbuds in and whispering because I can't risk having my parents hear me, but I'm now connected to a community and a lifeline." Some of those kids are cisgender, gay, lesbian, bi, queer. Many of them are trans and non-binary. So that's one sphere, and I'll share that it was powerful and devastating, and also inspiring. Just a few weeks after the elections in November, we held our first ever Texas Shabbaton.
Okay.
And the kids who were there were mostly from the Southwest, and a lot of trans and non-binary kids, and kids saying things like, "Clearly we are now disposable to America," or "I have support at home, but I feel guilty because I know that my being trans makes my parents' life so much harder," or "I feel so unsafe now." And then kids were able to move to talk about how they could remember and connect with their strength and their resilience. So that's on the kind of direct teen front. On the advocacy front, we have had a Department of Community Mobilizations for the last 7 years. There was an earlier time when we were working more proactively to advance LGBTQ rights. Of course, now we're working to protect LGBTQ rights. The majority of the assaults on our rights are assaults on trans rights, and are assaults on the rights of trans kids in particular. So the good news is that we have slowly but consistently been increasing the ranks of the number of Jewish community organizations and leaders that are willing to publicly speak out. You mentioned the Thrive Coalition earlier, which is a coalition of local, regional, and national organizations around the country. We started with, I think, 15 organizations. Today we have over 340. That will only grow because it has to grow, because that needs to be what it means to, be a Jew in America.
You are stepping back at a time where, as you just put it, like, trans rights are under assault in so many parts of this country. Just a few days ago, before we sat down, the Southern Baptists voted to essentially commit themselves to a national ongoing campaign to repeal marriage equality, which might have felt like a ludicrous thing a year or two ago, but then when one considers the overturning of Roe v. Wade,
right,
the potential of these multi-decade campaigns are conceivable. Beyond saying join the Thrive Coalition, and every Jewish organization should, and we at JCRC, of course, are proud to be a member of the Thrive Coalition.
Well,
what does the Jewish community need to be doing right now, both to support its LGBTQ members and to more broadly show up on these issues in America?
All right. So, we see it really as kind of a two-pronged approach. There's what needs to happen internally. And I mean, one of our kind of refrains is reminding Jewish leaders, don't assume that the queer people in your congregation, in your day school, in your JCC feel supported, because they probably don't. They need to hear it from you. And I've said, just like we needed to hear from our non-Jewish friends on October 8th, I'm not saying it's an exact parallel, obviously, but it is a time of people feeling threatened and under siege and vulnerable and needing to hear, particularly from the leaders of their own communities, we're here for you. Yeah. We're going to fight for you. So that's one level that is key. And then the other level is, there's a lot of power and influence within certain Jewish organizations in this country, among certain Jewish leaders in this country. People are very outspoken about all sorts of things. And I think that Jews need to be outspoken about a lot right now as this country slides into authoritarianism. But when we talk about the attacks on trans rights and on the very lives of trans youth, we need to have, I think, we need to see every rabbi in this country saying, this is a desecration of who we are. We need to make sure that our kids can live healthy, whole lives. That's our responsibility. And that needs to happen in the public sphere. It needs to happen in the political sphere. Obviously, sometimes people say, well, we can't do anything partisan. That is not a partisan position. That is a human rights, ethical, profoundly moral, and I would say profoundly Jewish position. When we were fighting for marriage equality in Massachusetts, as I said earlier, it was not the norm to support marriage equality. And this is a story I know you've heard before, Jeremy, but I assume not all of your listeners have, which is that I came face to face often several times a day with people making it clear that it was not the norm to support marriage equality among Jews, because I and others would stand holding a bright turquoise banner with the words in white on it saying, the Massachusetts Jewish community supports equal marriage, and we'd stand in front of the State House for hours. And every block of time when we would stand there, somewhere between 5 to 10 different people would rush up to us angry, and we could see the anger on their faces, from a distance as they approached us, and they would rush up to us and say, how dare you stand here with this sign? This is not what Jews believe. And they were right. And I did know that it was not what all Jews believed, or maybe not even what most Jews believed at that point in Massachusetts. But I knew that it would become what almost all Jews believed. And I knew we would get there. And I knew it was important for us to keep standing there as a result.
Great. Thanks. You have, as has been sort of touched on, you have taken a small local organization from your apartment and a $25,000 grant to a multi-million-dollar national organization with multiple staff in several cities. And now you are stepping back after 24 years. What advice do you have for leaders who are trying to build organizations, grow organizations that will be sustained beyond their own time?
Find the people who believe in you, who are going to invest in you, who are the people you can return to when you feel shaken, who will help you remember that you actually are on firm ground. Mm-hmm. I had so many of those people early on and feel so grateful that they showed up in my life. Many of them actually kind of came through the JCRC community.
What's your hope for the next chapter of Keshet?
My hope for the next chapter of Keshet is that, 20 years from now, someone will be speaking about the violations of trans rights today and the horrifically irresponsible ways that legislators are jeopardizing kids' lives. And they will talk about that, and there will be people around them who won't believe that ever happened.
And what is your hope for the next chapter of Idit Klein?
My hope for the next chapter,
if you're ready to say.
I do not have a specific vision that I can outline currently, but I will say broadly, in some ways it parallels the advice I would give to a leader. It's doing work that feels profoundly connected to my purpose, with people by whom I feel supported and who I want to support, whom I love and by whom I feel loved, and to feel part of a community.
This has been really wonderful to sit down and talk to you. You've really changed my life in profound ways. As I mentioned, got to meet you when you were trying to raise some money to do the finishing of a film, and ended up being an opportunity for me to, for the first time in my life, to be actively involved in an LGBTQ Jewish organization. And in no small part, your leadership and Keshet's leadership and the role that Keshet played in changing the Boston Jewish community, that made it possible for me to come here. So I am forever grateful to you for all that you have done for me personally and for our community.
We're a profoundly Boston organization, and that's something I'm very proud of.
Well, thank you, Idit, and thank you to everybody who's listening, and really excited for whatever comes next, both for you and for Keshet.
Thank you, and Pride Sameach. Happy Pride to everybody.
Pride Sameach.